August 1944, in the dense Ardennes woods, the German flank was under pressure and the Allied advance threatened to sweep east. Deep in a bivouac near a ravine of steep slopes, Staff Sergeant Luc Morel, formerly a civilian auto mechanic in Rouen, crouched beneath the hull of a battered M4 Sherman Easy Eight. The tank's transmission groaned, and its tracks had slipped on the last hill climb during yesterday's advance. Across the valley lay the slope, a near-sheer 45-degree incline of pocked terrain and broken rock used by the Germans to anchor their defence. On the ridge above, elements of a Panther battalion waited, confident that no Allied medium tank could claw itself up that gradient. Their doctrine declared heavy tanks the masters of hills, while medium tanks bogged down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Luc's eyes reflected his past. Before the war, he had run a small garage in Rouen, tuning engines, shifting gearboxes, and coaxing more torque from reluctant machines. Now, in fatigues stained with grease, he listened to the Sherman's gear train whine and hissed at the vibrations, remembering the feel of bearings and the smell of hot oil. The platoon commander shook his head and said, in a voice that accepted the map and the rules, that they were not climbing that and that the Panthers would sit above and pick them off. But Luc's mind flickered back to his son's voice through a clandestine radio and to a single sentence that had become an ember in him. "Do not give up, Papa, ever." He decided. If the medium tank could not climb the slope within the rules, he would change the rules. That evening, the crew gathered in the cramped engine bay. Luc spread a crude drawing on an oil-stained crate and explained his plan in quiet, clipped phrases. A modified intermediate gear ratio, an extra idler, block, and deeper grousers, track extensions scavenged through the night, would lower the final drive ratio and increase torque at the sprocket. The Sherman would surrender top speed but gain climbing ability. The others exchanged glances equal parts daring and fearful, hope flickering like a borrowed match. Through the night, Luc worked under a flashlight, unauthorized and undocumented, fitting longer grousers and re-gearing the final drive to a lower ratio. He knew the risk. Bearings could overheat, teeth could shear, and the transmission could burn out under the new strain. So he reinforced seals and fashioned a crude duct to nudge air across hot surfaces when he could. Dawn rose pale and brittle. Crews formed up, and the slope loomed like a cliff. The Panther crews lounged across the ridge, commanders proud and perhaps complacent, certain their weight and frontal armour would win the day. The Allies began their advance, and the Sherman, dubbed the slow climber, led the platoon. Luc climbed into the driver's hatch, the modified transmissions humming like a restless animal, and at his command the tank began its ascent inch by inch. At first the gears groaned and the tracks bit the shale and roots in small angry bites. The climb was a conversation of metal and weight and will. Momentum gathered in piecemeal fashion and then swelled until the Sherman, against the expectation of doctrine and of men who trusted manuals more than instinct, crested the ridge, while Panthers still laboured to bring their heavy hulls to forward incline. The hillside echoed with surprised cheers and the brief sound of victory. After the crest, men shouted and clapped, some laughing, and for a few moments the fatigue of months lifted as if by a gust. Luc felt the weight of their looks, the unspoken question of whether mechanics could change a doctrine. Word of the climb spread by radio and runners, and by afternoon officers from brigade headquarters examined the modifications with sceptical eyes, then studied them. Technical officers took notes and sketched the grousers and the altered gear ratios, and while the fix remained unofficial, it would not be ignored because results on the battlefield force fast answers. Across the valley, Panther commanders radioed in confusion as Allied armour poured through the newly opened gap. In minutes, infantry exploited the breach, and the wider force poured forward while German units scrambled to close a flank they had thought secure. Back in the engine bay, after the crest, Luc sat cross-legged on the sprocket guard and studied the transmission. The fix worked, but it had consequences. The final drive ran hotter than normal, oil looked darker and flecked with metal, and one bearing showed higher temperature than the rest. The Germans attempted to react by reinforcing the ridge with engineers and anti-tank guns, bringing doctrine and mass to bear. But the terrain that they believed favoured heavy armour had become a double-edged blade. Steep slopes hampered mobility and undermined mechanical sympathy. The Panther's weight created higher ground pressure and narrower tracks that bit poorly into shale and scree, where the Sherman's wider footprint and added grousers now distributed load more effectively. A Panther attempting a steep climb would often slip and stall, while a re-geared Sherman could trade speed for steady torque. The tactical result showed itself in action. A Panther attempting a sudden steep ascent lost purchase, its tracks spun, the hull listed alarmingly, and the crew abandoned the vehicle when it slid on fractured stone and dug its belly into a berm. A Panther sliding downhill showed that doctrine and raw weight could be defeated by adaptation. Yet innovation carried cost. By afternoon, Luc's Sherman showed new signs of wear. The transmission whine had risen to a higher-pitched shriek, and small metal chips glittered in the oil pan. The driver reported intermittent loss of third gear under heavy load, and Luc knew the gearbox was paying the price for his defiance. He called for field spares, but supply trucks were hours behind in a theatre where logistics stretched thin and committees met slowly. Still, the platoon pressed the advantage. The mission was larger than a single vehicle, and Luc accepted the risk because successful momentum often required sacrifice. When the final push came, the Sherman led another ascent over a narrower spur, the incline deeper and the loose stone worse, and Luc ordered constant low engine speed to keep torque steady and clutch engagement patient. The tank moved with agonized determination, sprockets chewed at fractured ground, and grousers hooked in like claws. Midway, the transmission protested and a gear slipped. For a breathless moment, the Sherman hung half on the slope, metal groaning above a shallow drop. Hands worked fast. The crew downshifted and fed the engine more patiently, and the vehicle crept forward until it found purchase and moved to the crest. In the cold after battle, Luc crawled beneath the Sherman and inspected the gearbox. Braided wraps smeared with oil and grit, a splintered tooth on a ring gear, and the quiet evidence of wear that answered for risk. Engineers later catalogued the field changes and recommended production adjustments. Grousers would be added to some units, and revised final drive ratios considered for special mountain variants, a small institutional recognition of an improvised success. Years after the war, Luc returned to Rouen and reopened the same garage he had worked before. Conflict reshaped everything, and he kept a worn wrench from the Sherman as a memento. He told the story in low tones to customers, of a slope that would not be denied, and of a night when the rules were bent and a hill changed a front. The tracks at the bottom of that ridge were smoothed by rain and seasons. When the wind came off the ridge, Luc could hear the echo of groaning gears, and the ghost of a climb that had altered a Toma campaign. He thought of his son's radio words, and of a mechanic's small acts of defiance that, in a single costly night, let medium tanks outclimb what men had believed to be impossible. After the daring climb, the platoon rolled over the ridge and stunned the German flank that had believed itself untouchable. The air was sharp with smoke and echoes of gunfire as the Panthers scrambled to reposition, their commanders shouting orders through the chaos. Across the valley, the sudden appearance of Allied tanks cresting a slope that was considered impossible shattered German confidence. Orders rippled through the enemy lines. Send reinforcements, seal the gap, hold the ridge at any cost. But the Allied medium tanks, nimble and relentless, exploited every second of hesitation. They poured through the opening like water finding a crack, guns blazing, engines roaring, treads biting into the torn earth. For a brief and crucial moment, the balance of the battlefield tilted in favour of the Allies. Back in the woods behind the ridge, Staff Sergeant Luc Morel sat beside his Sherman, his hands blackened with grease and soot. The tank idled beside him, its metal still hot from the climb, ticking softly as it cooled. Luc crouched near the rear of the hull, prying open the access panel to inspect the oil line. The liquid shimmered dark and thin under his flashlight. He smirked at the sight of the scorched casing on the final drive. The illegal fix had worked, but the heat was brutal. The transmission bearing was running far hotter than any manual recommended. If it failed mid-climb, the entire machine would seize. But for now, it held. He wiped sweat from his brow, his breath visible in the cool morning air, and got back to work. He fashioned extra cooling ducts from scavenged parts, sawing and bending reclaimed radiator piping from a destroyed half-track nearby. With a few bolts and clamps, he routed airflow into the cramped housing behind the transmission. It was crude and unsanctioned, but it would buy time. Every adjustment defied the field manual. The Ordnance Corps would call it a violation, but Luc didn't care. He wasn't fighting for paperwork. He was fighting to keep his tank moving. He knew that if headquarters ever inspected his modifications, he and his crew could face disciplinary action, or worse. Yet, in war, survival often came from defiance, not permission. Meanwhile, across the valley, the Germans were beginning to understand the problem. Panther crews, still reeling from the surprise assault, reported losing their once assured advantage on steep terrain. Their heavy armor, so feared on open ground, now became a burden. The Panthers weighed over 45 tons, and their narrow tracks, designed for speed and stability, dug helplessly into the loose shale and crumbled soil of the hillside. The more they tried to climb, the more they slid backward. Their engines strained, and their transmissions screamed in protest. The once invincible machines had met a problem their engineering had not anticipated: the hill itself. Their commander, furious and unwilling to accept defeat, ordered the tanks to attempt even steeper climbs, hoping to regain control of the upper ridges. But physics did not bend to arrogance. The weight of the Panther was too great, its traction too poor. Crews struggled to hold position as Allied Shermans, lighter and now far more capable, began flanking from unexpected angles. Every Panther that stalled became a target for artillery or a casualty of gravity. In a matter of hours, the battlefield dynamic had changed entirely. Luc watched the chaos through his binoculars from a shaded rise near the tree line. He didn't cheer. He only observed quietly, his mind dissecting the cause. Talk was important, yes, but something deeper was at play. It was not just power that determined victory, it was pressure. He crouched near his tank, dragging a stick through the dirt to explain his thought to the crew. "It's about ground pressure," he muttered. "The Panther presses the earth harder than we do. That's why they sink, and we don't." He realized that reducing ground pressure meant increasing surface contact. It was not a new concept. Farmers in France had learned it centuries ago with wagons on muddy roads, but applied to steel monsters like the Sherman, it became revolutionary. He ordered the crew to tighten the track tension and fit the longer grousers he had scavenged earlier. The grousers extended the width of each tread by mere inches, but it was enough. When he stood back to watch his work, the Sherman seemed to crouch lower, its stance broader, ready to grip the earth like a beast prepared to climb again. Later that day, German reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead, taking hurried photographs of the Allied positions. Among the images later analysed by their command, one note stood out in the intelligence report. "We observed an enemy medium, tank climbing an incline previously thought impossible for any combat vehicle." The German analyst underlined the words "thought impossible" twice. It was a small admission, but it echoed through their engineering corps, mirroring what history would later record. German officers indeed reported that the Sherman could scale slopes thought impossible for any Panzer. By evening, the forest filled with murmurs of what the mechanics had achieved. In the Allied command tent, under the dull glow of lanterns and the hum of generators, Luc's platoon commander gave a formal debrief. The general leaned over the table, his finger tracing the ridgeline on the map. "Our Sherman climbed the slope in second gear," the commander said, "while the Panther tried it in third. Yet we reached the crest minutes before them." The general looked up, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "How is that possible?" he asked. No one answered directly, but the grin on Luc's face told part of the story. The discussion continued as aides scribbled notes and radio operators relayed the report up the chain. The order was soon issued: relieve the Panther flank positions immediately and exploit the gap. Luc stood quietly near the tent flap, the faint light catching his worn features. Pride burned in his chest, but he said nothing. To admit what he had done would be to invite trouble. His modifications were not authorized, not documented, not approved by anyone but necessity. Yet the results were undeniable. The Sherman platoon had achieved what command considered a mechanical impossibility. That night, as campfires dotted the clearing and engines cooled under the stars, Luc sat apart from the others. He cleaned his tools by lantern light, wiping oil from the wrench heads and folding his rag into neat squares. He listened to distant gunfire echoing through the valley, now slowly receding as German resistance weakened. His mind turned over questions that had no easy answer. How? Many tanks had been left behind over the years because their crews believed the manuals more than their instincts. How many battles had been lost not to the enemy, but to the limits men imposed upon themselves? The thought stirred him deeply. The war was not just about courage or numbers, it was about innovation born from desperation. A mechanic's intuition had broken a rule, and that rule had broken a front. Luc wondered if anyone would ever write about that. He did not need medals or reports. He only wanted the knowledge to survive, that sometimes machines had more potential than their makers ever allowed them to show. He looked at the Sherman parked nearby, its hull scarred, its tracks dusted with the grey of the ridge it had conquered. To him, it was more than steel. It was proof. By dawn, the ridge was quiet except for the faint clatter of tools and the steady rhythm of engines starting again. Luc finished reinforcing his cooling duct system, tightening the last clamp, sealing the gap with melted resin from a spare fuse. He patted the hull softly, as though speaking to a living thing. "You did well, old girl," he murmured. The tank responded with a low rumble as the engine came alive once more. From the next ridge, he could see the Panther line pulling back, smoke curling from exhausts and burning oil. The Germans had realized their disadvantage, and the terrain they once claimed as their fortress now worked against them. The Allied advance would continue east, each mile earned through improvisation, sweat, and defiance of rules written far from the battlefield. Luc climbed into the hatch, his crew waiting for orders. He gave them a small nod, the kind that carried both pride and caution. The Sherman rolled forward again, its modified transmission humming with the steady rhythm of resolve. The war was far from over, but on that morning, amidst the smoke and silence of the ridgeline, one man's forbidden fix had rewritten a small chapter of how battles were fought and how machines, like men, could rise beyond the limits others believed they had. The German High Command reacted swiftly after their unexpected loss of ground. By the time dusk fell, their Panther tank battalion had already begun repositioning to the reverse slope of the ridge. Engineers worked feverishly through the night, pounding steel stakes into the rocky soil and anchoring the tanks against the incline. The terrain was treacherous, too steep, too loose, and too unpredictable, but their doctrine demanded it. Heavy tank on hill equals domination. The Panthers were to become immovable guardians of the high ground, their massive 75mm guns commanding every valley below. Floodlights flickered, and shadows of men and machines stretched long across the mountainside as preparations continued. The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Hold the crest, destroy any Allied armour attempting to climb, and seal the flanking route that had embarrassed them hours before. Yet, in the quiet of the nearby forest, Staff Sergeant Luc Morel already knew their weakness. He had studied the Panthers in both manuals and recs. He knew their fearsome reputation, their thick frontal armour, and their devastating firepower. But he also knew the soft underbelly of their engineering, the fragile final drive, the overstrained transmission, and the suspension that groaned under the pressure of steep climbs. Those weaknesses were invisible to those who worshipped their power, but not to a mechanic like Luc. He had seen too many tanks crippled by pride disguised as engineering perfection. At first light, Luc gathered his crew around the front of his Sherman. The dawn was thin and grey, the sky streaked with smoke and fog from the night's bombardments. He crouched by the left track, tapping the grouser teeth with a wrench to test their grip. "Stay in low gear early," he instructed his driver, a young corporal with grease still on his sleeves, Let the torque build slowly. Don't flip into high until we're past the crest. If you rush her, she'll lose her pull. The driver gave a hesitant nod, half believing, half uncertain. They all knew Luc's modifications were off the books. If the transmission failed under load, they would have no replacement. But in war, trust often had to run deeper than regulations. By dawn's second hour, the Sherman platoon began its advance. The air was thick with the metallic tang of exhaust and the rumble of synchronized engines. Ahead, the ridge rose like a sleeping beast, sharp, uneven, and covered with shattered stone. Somewhere beyond that incline, the German Panthers waited in ambush. The first shells came down like thunder. Panther gunners, positioned on the reverse slope, fired plunging rounds that screamed through the morning air and exploded against the ground ahead of the Shermans. The impacts tore through earth and shale, sending fragments clattering against hulls. The platoon held steady. Luc's voice cut through the intercom, calm and firm. "Low gear." "Let her climb," he ordered. The driver obeyed, and the tank responded like a living creature, its engine growling deep and steady. The modified transmission caught the torque, holding the balance between power and traction. The grousers bit into the slope, tearing small avalanches of rock behind them. To the observers on the ridge, it looked impossible. The Sherman was climbing faster than any of them expected, its tracks gripping where even Panthers had slipped. The Germans opened fire again, but the plunging rounds missed their mark, skidding harmlessly off the incline. Luc's tank pressed forward. Each meter gained a defiance of both gravity and expectation. Behind him, another Sherman followed, and another. The line advanced like a chain of determined beasts. The Panther tanks, now forced to adjust their aim downward, found their own hulls shifting under recoil. One Panther, its driver misjudging the slope, stalled mid-turn and began to slide backward. The commander inside shouted orders, but the tank's mass defeated him. It reversed awkwardly down the slope, trying to reposition before being struck. Luc saw the motion through his periscope and gritted his teeth. "They're losing grip," he muttered. They built power, not balance. Moments later, the impossible happened. Luc's Sherman crested the ridge first. The crew cheered briefly, their voices drowned by the roar of the engine. They had done it again. The German flank, hastily arranged for defence, was now exposed from above. Luc's gunner swung the turret left, locking on a Panther that was still rotating its hull to respond. "Fire!" Luc commanded. The main gun recoiled with a sharp blast, and the armour-piercing shell struck the enemy's turret ring, jamming it solid. Smoke poured from the Panther's rear compartment as its crew scrambled to bail out. Behind the ridge, Allied infantry seized the opportunity. Troops moved in tight formations, ducking between craters and wreckage, exploiting the gap the tanks had opened. The German flank began to unravel. Communication lines faltered, and panic rippled through the ranks. Orders shouted over radios went unanswered. The Panthers tried to pivot, but the steep terrain turned each maneuver into a sluggish dance. Their heavy frames groaned and skidded, unable to maintain speed. What was meant to be a strong defensive line was now a chaotic retreat. Luc watched the enemy's movement from his hatch. He could see the desperation Panthers attempting to swing their turrets uphill, engineers waving for more traction chains, infantry retreating into the tree line. His own tank idled at the crest, engine rumbling confidently. The fix had not just worked, it had rewritten the tactical assumptions of the battlefield. Inside the German command tent at the base of the slope, the Panther battalion commander slammed his fist onto the map table. "These Americans," he growled, "they climb where we thought only light vehicles could go." His officers exchanged uneasy glances. For years, their doctrine had been built upon one foundation. Superior armour and firepower outweighed manoeuvrability. But now, that certainty was crumbling before their eyes. The commander barked for engineers to widen the tank tracks and add improvised traction cleats. Others were ordered to reinforce the reverse slope with gravel and timbers, hoping to stabilize the ground. But the modifications were desperate, temporary, and too late. By the time the engineers reached the forward line, The Shermans were already descending into the valley beyond, cutting off the Panthers' supply road. Smoke plumes marked burning vehicles, and the sound of retreating half-tracks echoed through the ridges. The German defensive doctrine, once a symbol of order and strength, was collapsing under the weight of its own rigidity. Luc knew the risk of what he had done. His modifications pushed the machine beyond what the designers had intended. Every time they climbed, every degree of slope, was borrowed time. The bearings could seize, the transmission could fracture, or the cooling ducts could fail. But as he looked out across the broken battlefield, he realized something profound. The strength of a tank wasn't in its thickness of armor or the size of its gun, it was in its adaptability, in the courage of those who dared to bend the rules to survive. The platoon regrouped on the far side of the ridge. Mechanics emerged from cover, wiping grime from their hands, checking the treads and oil lines. Luc crouched by the final drive again, feeling the warmth radiate through the casing. It was hot, too hot, but holding. His driver knelt beside him and asked, "Think she can do it again?" Luc smiled faintly, his eyes tired but determined. "She'll have to," he said. "The war's not waiting for us. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." In the distance, the sun began to rise over the shattered ridge, casting long rays through the smoke. The battlefield was littered with the scars of combat shell holes, broken treads, twisted metal, but through it all, the Shermans stood ready, engines purring steadily, like beasts that had learned to climb mountains once thought insurmountable. Back at the German command post, the frustrated Panther commander stared at the map, tracing the Allied advance with disbelief. "We underestimated them," he muttered. "They found a way to make those machines dance." His adjutant nodded grimly. Reports from the front confirmed the impossible. Medium tanks had outclimbed Panthers on inclines, exceeding 45 degrees. For the first time, the terrain no longer favoured the Germans. By afternoon, the Allied column pushed deeper into the valley. The once dominant Panthers, designed to rule from high ground, had become symbols of their own limitation. Luc's simple, illegal fix, a change of gear ratios, a rerouted cooling line, a few scavenged parts had quietly rewritten the battlefield. It was not sanctioned innovation. It was survival innovation. As Luc sat atop his Sherman, watching the smoke drift over the hills, he thought not of glory, but of the quiet irony of war, that sometimes the smallest wrench turn could undo an empire's confidence. He knew that his secret would likely fade, buried beneath reports that credited strategy or timing, but he didn't mind. The truth was enough for him, that a mechanic's defiance, born from necessity, had given his brothers in steel a fighting chance on a mountain they were never meant to climb. The price of innovation, Luc Morel would soon learn, is often written not in medals, but in metal fatigue. The ridge had been taken, the German line fractured, but as the column advanced, deeper into the Ardennes foothills, the strain on his modified Sherman began to tell. It started with a faint pitch in the gear whiner note slightly higher than usual, almost imperceptible except to a mechanic's ear. By mid-morning, the whine had become a shriek. The transmission oil pressure fluctuated erratically on the gauge, needle twitching like a nervous heartbeat. Luc frowned and leaned over the dashboard, tapping the glass as if that could settle it. "Third gear's slipping under load," the driver reported through clenched teeth. The tank lurched as it climbed a rough embankment, the gearbox grinding in protest. Luc ordered a halt. Dust settled around the halted Sherman as the other tanks rumbled past. He climbed down from the commander's hatch, the acrid smell of burnt oil wafting through the open engine louvers. The terrain was merciless, jagged rocks, loose shale, and roots exposed by shell fire. Around him, engineers knelt over open engine bays, wrenches, clanking against steel, faces slick with sweat. The air was heavy with tension. Every man could feel the front tightening. Command had reported renewed German resistance ahead, Panthers regrouping with anti-tank guns dug into the higher ridges. To outflank them, the Shermans would need to climb again, this time steeper than before. Luc opened the inspection hatch on the transmission and peered inside. The gears glistened with dark oil, streaked with fine metallic dust. The bearing casings were too hot to touch. He cursed softly in French, then reached for a rag, wiping away grime to check the feed line. "We've overstrained her," he muttered. His loader crouched beside him, anxious. "Can she keep moving?" Luc didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the slope ahead, jagged and cruel, easily 50 degrees at its steepest point. The Panthers on the far ridge had taken up overwatch positions, confident that no Allied tank would dare climb such an incline. "She'll move," Luc finally said. "But she won't like it." The men around him nodded, silent and trusting. They knew the risks of Luc's unauthorized modifications, the untested ratios, the improvised cooling ducts scavenged from wrecks, the unconventional gearing. Still, those same changes had saved their lives before. The Sherman's new gearing had made it climb like no other tank in the unit. It had turned doctrine into myth. And now, it would have to do so again. As the platoon reformed, Luc made his final adjustments. He checked each track connector, tightening the pins with deliberate precision. He scraped mud and stones from the grousers, ensuring the metal teeth could bite deep into the rock. Then he turned to the engine compartment, tweaking the accelerator linkage to smooth its power curve. The driver watched, pale under the dust. "What's the plan?" he asked. "The plan," Luc said with calm conviction, "is to climb without anger. No surging, no sudden shifts. Let the tractor gear do the work. We crawl before we conquer." The platoon commander's voice crackled over the radio. "All Shermans, advance. Objective ridge east of Sector 12. Panthers entrenched. Proceed under cover." The driver gave a sharp nod. Luc closed the hatch, sealing the tank's interior in steel and heat. He could hear his own breath inside his helmet, steady and deliberate. The slope rose before them like a wall. The first few meters were brutal. The Sherman's engine roared, and its tracks clawed for purchase, sending shards of stone tumbling downhill. The tank shuddered, but moved. Luc felt every vibration through the hull floor, every jolt as the modified final drive strained to transfer torque. "First gear," he ordered. "Keep it slow." The driver obeyed, sweat streaming down his face. The tank advanced inch by inch. The incline was near impossible, 50 degrees of unrelenting rock and debris, but the Sherman held its line. Halfway up, the gear whine returned, louder now. The transmission screamed in agony as pressure mounted. Luc's instincts screamed back, "Not yet, hold her steady." He placed a hand on the turret wall as though comforting a living thing. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "You've done worse." Then, at just the right moment, he gave the order. "Shift to second gently." The driver hesitated, then moved the lever. The gears caught with a crunch, and the tank surged forward. The engine roared, the hull trembled, but the Sherman climbed. Behind them, one of the Panthers attempted to reposition for a shot. Its treads dug into the slope, but the weight was too much. The massive machine slid sideways, tearing up chunks of earth as its crew fought for control. Luc's Sherman crested the ridge just as the Panther lost traction completely. The German tank slid backward, striking a rock outcrop and halting awkwardly. Its crew bailed out moments before it caught fire from return Allied fire. The Sherman's gun swung around. "Target! Rear hull of Panther!" Luc shouted. The gunner lined up, fired, and the shell struck true. The Panther erupted in smoke. The German flank, seeing the disaster unfold, began to unravel. One tank fled downhill, another fired blindly and missed. The Allied platoon, emboldened by Luc's lead, surged forward. They poured over the ridge, unleashing a storm of fire. But inside Luc's tank, the celebration was brief. Warning lights blinked red. The transmission bearing glowed, the smell of scorched lubricant filling the crew compartment. Luc felt the vibration change deeper, more uneven. The gears were beginning to shear. "She's going!" the driver yelled. "We're losing pressure." Luc grabbed the radio handset. "Command, this is Red 3. Transmission bearings failing. If it seizes, we're dead weight. Request spare or recovery crew." Static crackled. The reply came firm but cold. "Negative, Red 3. Push forward." The "Flanks breaking, we need momentum." Luc's jaw tightened. "Understood," he said. He set the handset down slowly. "We push," he told his crew. "The mission is bigger than this tank." The men nodded. No one argued. They advanced again, engine groaning, metal screaming. Every rotation of the sprocket was a battle of endurance. By the time they reached the next ridge, the gearbox was howling like a wounded animal. Still, they pressed on. Around them, the battlefield had transformed. Smoke hung thick over the hills, and the air reeked of fuel and cordite. The German flank had collapsed. Panthers lay wrecked or abandoned, their crews retreating into the forests. When the gunfire finally faded, Luc slumped back in his seat. The gauges were red across the board. Oil pressure near zero, temperature climbing. The Sherman's heart was breaking down. He gave the order to halt. The crew climbed out, blinking in the haze of victory. They stood on a slope littered with blackened steel and shattered glass. The ridge they had conquered now lay silent, scarred by battle. Luc walked to the front of the tank, placed a hand on the scorched final drive casing. It was blistering hot, metal warped slightly from heat stress. "She gave everything," he whispered. Around him, other crews worked quickly to repair their machines. Field engineers arrived with spare parts, setting up makeshift workshops among the rocks. Wrenches clinked, and hammers rang like muted bells of survival. As evening fell, Luc gathered his small crew. They sat on ammo crates beside the Sherman, eating cold rations and staring into the sunset. The air was quiet, except for the occasional crack of distant artillery. "You think command will approve your fix now?" the loader asked with a weary grin. Luc chuckled softly. "They'll pretend it never happened," he said. "Regulations don't like miracles." He gazed at the tank, its hull streaked with soot and oil, its treads caked with the mud of victory. "Still," he murmured. "She climbed every hill they said she couldn't." The others nodded in silence. The victory had come at a cost, not just mechanical, but human. Every innovation carried risk. Every act of defiance demanded payment. When night settled fully, Luc took one last look at the ridge they had conquered. The stars hung cold and bright above the smoke. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the war still raged. But for now, the mountain stood as proof that determination could rewrite physics. His illegal fix had done more than win a battle. It had changed how men thought about what machines could do. Tomorrow, he would rebuild the gearbox, replace the bearings, maybe even redesign the ducts again. But tonight, he allowed himself a rare smile. Innovation had a cost, yes, but on this battered ridge, that cost had bought them victory. The smoke of the ridge still lingers when the order to advance comes. The German flank, once iron-strong, lies shattered and open. Luc's Sherman platoon rolls forward into the valley, the earth trembling under the rhythm of steel tracks. His tank leads again, the same battered, overheated machine that had climbed slopes once believed impossible. Behind him, other Shermans follow, engines growling in harmony, their crews whispering disbelief and pride. The story of that climb spreads fast through the ranks. Soldiers laugh and slap the turret armor, calling it Luc's Mountain Goat. The name sticks. What was once a desperate field fix is now a symbol of ingenuity and grit. At the forward command post, officers and engineers gather around Luc's vehicle like curious scientists around a relic. Grease-stained hands trace the improvised ducts, the reshaped gear housing, the hand-cut grousers bolted onto the tracks. One captain shakes his head, muttering, "This is nowhere in the manual." Another grins, "Then we better rewrite the manual." Reports are written, sketches drawn. The discovery is listed as non-standard, untested, unauthorized, yet impossible to ignore. The general himself arrives, studying the tank that defied the slope. "You broke the rules," he says evenly, "but you also broke the ridge." He orders the ordnance section to run immediate trials for potential adoption. Luc, standing beside his crew, says nothing. His eyes drift to the worn transmission casing metal glowing faintly from strain, oil seeping at the seams. The victory came at a price, and he knows it. By dusk, the valley hums with Allied armour pushing deeper into contested ground. The Panthers have pulled back to regroup, leaving behind wrecks and abandoned vehicles. The terrain that once favoured them now belongs to the Allies. Luc watches the horizon from his turret, where smoke mingles with the dying orange light. Around him, his men laugh, trade cigarettes, and share tales of the climb, how they felt the tank lift and surge when others slipped, how they doubted, then believed. Yet Luc remains quiet. He remembers the jolt when the bearing nearly seized, the smell of burning oil, the scream of metal under strain. For every victory, there was a whisper of failure lurking beneath. Later, engineers begin drafting official blueprints of Luc's fix-adjusted gear ratios, reinforced cooling lines, traction-boosting track extensions. It becomes clear that the illegal adjustment had turned into innovation. Command authorizes trials. Some officers protest, citing safety and regulation, but the results silence them. The Sherman, once dismissed as average beside the Panther, now proves capable of conquering near-impossible ground. Reports from field tests note enhanced traction and climb rate achieved, though mechanical stress remains high. The compromise is accepted. In war, nothing perfect lasts, only what works. Luc sits alone atop the turret as the night wind cools the metal beneath him. He stares at the stars, thinking of home, of his young son's words, "Don't give up, Papa." Those words echo through the hum of the idling engine. Around him, the valley glows faintly with the light of countless vehicles moving forward, a river of armour flowing through the dark. For a brief moment, he feels something like peace, not triumph, not relief, but understanding. His hands, calloused and burned from days of repair, rest on the steel he bent to his will. Innovation, he realizes, isn't born in factories or blueprints, but in fear, necessity, and courage. When dawn rises, the order comes to move again. His crew mounts up, joking that maybe the next hill will be easier. Luc smiles, though his heart is heavy. He knows the gearbox won't survive another full climb. Still, he grips the periscope handles and nods to the driver. "Let's go. One more ridge." The tank lurches forward, engine roaring, a sound half mechanical, half alive. Behind it, the scarred slope stands as silent proof of what Feefel, one mechanic, dared to do when the odds said he couldn't. The cost of innovation is written in worn steel and burned oil, but the reward, freedom, survival, momentum, carries on. The Sherman rolls down the far side of the ridge, its shadow stretching long against the dawn. Somewhere in the distance, the war continues. But on that crest, in that single moment, Luc's machine and his courage have already changed its course. Years have passed since the war, and Luc Morel is no longer the young, grease-stained mechanic crouched under a Sherman's hull. Now, in his 70s, his hair silvered and his hands marked by decades of work, he returns to the ridge where history quietly unfolded. The landscape has softened. Rain and wind have smoothed the shattered rock, and wildflowers bloom in the furrows where steel tracks once tore the earth. At the foot of the slope, a small plaque stands, simple and unassuming, yet heavy with meaning. Here, the slow climber crested, the impossible incline. In memory of the men and machines that dared. Luc traces the etched letters with a finger, recalling the grit, fear, and ingenuity of that August day in 1944. He remembers the Panther crews, confident that the steep gradient would shield their flank, and he thinks of the gamble he took, bending regulations, risking the Sherman, risking his crew, risking his career. The memory of modifying the final drive, installing extra track grousers and jury-rigging cooling ducts comes vividly. The engine's roar, the groan of gear teeth under strain, and the smell of overheated oil are all engraved in his mind. That single, illegal fix had changed not just the outcome of a battle, but the way medium tanks were viewed in tactical planning. The ridge became a symbol. Terrain was no longer an obstacle to avoid, but a weapon to be leveraged. Back in Rouen, Luc maintains his garage with the precision and care of a craftsman who knows the value of every tool. Among the wrenches, gauges, and spare parts, he keeps one item above all others, a steel wrench lifted from the Sherman's final drive during the climb. He shows it to apprentices and young mechanics, his eyes twinkling with quiet pride. "Rules matter," he says, voice firm but gentle, "but sometimes you have to invent better ones when the hill doesn't wait." The lesson is not simply about machines, but about courage, initiative, and the responsibility of taking calculated risks when circumstances demand it. Though the world has moved on, tanks now rust in museums or have been scrapped for metal, the echo of that moment lingers. Luc often returns at sunset, standing on the ridge, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. In that quiet, he imagines the thunder of tracks, the pulse of engines straining against impossible odds, and the precise moment when a medium tank, modified by one man's intuition, outclimbed what no one thought possible. The memory is, alive, sharper than any plaque or photograph, a testament to what human ingenuity can achieve when combined with courage and resolve. Luc smiles softly, feeling both the weight and the freedom of memory. He knows the climb was more than a mechanical feat. It was a testament to ambition, skill, and the belief that limitations exist to be challenged. "We did it for freedom," he murmurs, glancing at the valley below where the ridge dips toward the horizon. "And for France." In that smile rests a quiet triumph, a story of machines, men, and the moment when one mechanic's hand changed history. Decades after that fateful climb, Luc Morel's story had quietly entered the annals of tank history, known more in whispers among engineers and historians than in the roaring headlines of newspapers. The ridge, once scarred by combat, had grown serene. Wildflowers painted the slopes in yellows, blues, and purples, and small streams cut through the valley where shattered rocks had once challenged both man and machine. Luc walked slowly along the path the Sherman had taken, each step echoing faintly against the stones, as if the ridge itself remembered the weight of the armoured vehicle that had defied expectation. His thoughts drifted back to 1944, to the nights spent under cold stars, crouched beneath a hull, listening to the gears grind and the tracks slip. Every modification, every clandestine adjustment made in the shadows of war seemed almost impossible now, yet it had worked. Luc's mind wandered to his crew. Faces that had been young, full of fear and determination, now lived only in memory. He recalled the driver's steady hands, the gunner's sharp eyes, the radio operator's quiet courage. André, the youngest, had been wide-eyed and eager, a mechanic's son in spirit, though he never fully saw the Sherman crest, the impossible slope. Luc remembered the moment they reached the ridge, the first rays of dawn lighting the valley below, the roar of the engine, the clatter of tracks against rock, and the cheers that rose up even as smoke still clung to the hull. That day, they had not merely climbed a hill, they had rewritten a small part of history. The Sherman, modified with what military manuals would have called reckless ingenuity, had proven a point that no amount of doctrine could deny. Medium tanks could climb where heavy tanks struggled. Torque, traction, and the thoughtful application of mechanical intuition could overcome obstacles once deemed insurmountable. The Panthers, for all their firepower and armour, had been temporarily outmanoeuvred. Luc's modifications lowered final drive ratios, extended grousers, and improvised cooling ducts had given a tank designed for reliability a moment of audacity. It had worked, but at a cost. Transmission bearings had glowed red, oil had boiled, and the hull had shuddered under stress. The crew had risked life and livelihood for the success of the mission, and the hill had taken its toll in metal and human fatigue. In the years that followed, Luc became a quiet figure among the military engineers and historians who tracked armoured warfare. The slow climber, as the Sherman had been nicknamed, became a case study in creative engineering. Manuals were revised, grousers were standardized, and tank crews were trained to trust not only in their machines, but in the ingenuity of those who maintained them. Luc never sought accolades. He did not appear on posters or in military briefings. Instead, his legacy existed in the smooth hum of engines on slopes where terrain once dictated defeat, in the improved designs of subsequent medium tanks, and in the stories whispered between commanders and mechanics. Yet for Luc, the personal significance remained profound. In his garage back in Rouen, amidst engines, wrenches, and half-finished restorations, he kept the wrench from the Sherman's final drive as a talisman. Every young mechanic who entered was shown the tool and told, "Innovation is a responsibility. Sometimes it demands bending the rules, but never recklessness. Know your machine, know your limits, and trust your hands." The lesson extended beyond mechanics. It was about courage, intuition, and the quiet power of understanding one's craft. On certain evenings, Luc returned to the ridge. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint memory of tracks and groaning steel. He would close his eyes and imagine the Sherman's engine under load, the tracks biting into shale, the hill conquered by a combination of science, instinct, and daring. He pictured the Panthers struggling behind, the German crews scrambling, and the Allied infantry exploiting the gap. That visualization was a meditation, a private homage to a moment where human ingenuity and mechanical engineering had converged. It was a victory measured not merely in terrain or tactical gain, but in proof of possibility. The valley below had long since been populated with peaceful farms and quiet villages. Children ran where soldiers had once struggled, tractors replaced tanks, and the roar of engines became gentle hums. Yet Luc knew that for a brief moment in 1944, the impossible had been made real. And that realization, small though it might seem to the untrained eye, carried a weight far greater than medals or monuments. The Sherman, guided by one man's daring modifications, had outclimbed what every engineer and soldier believed it could not. It was a triumph of applied knowledge, courage, and the willingness to challenge assumptions, the very essence of innovation in its purest form. Luc smiled softly, standing at the crest of the ridge as the sun dipped low. He imagined the engines, the crew, and the roar of armoured determination echoing across the valley. The world had moved on. Machines rusted, soldiers aged, and history recorded facts. Yet, in that quiet moment, the ridge was alive with memory. A medium, tank, a clever mechanic, and a daring ascent had altered not only the battlefield, but the understanding of what was possible. He breathed deeply, feeling the wind on his face, the scent of wildflowers mingling with the faint echo of burnt oil, and he whispered to the ridge, to the memory of men and machines, to history itself, "We did it for freedom. We did it for France. And we did it because sometimes the hill cannot wait for rules." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.